Chris. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well, Heather. It's been a minute.
It has, and I'm just finishing up a cacao drink. What about you?
I've got a coffee drink made with a mocha pot, which you hadn't
Mm,
heard of before I'd
that's right.
mentioned it a couple of months ago. Um, this episode not sponsored by Bialetti, the manufacturer of mocha pot. We are not a sponsored podcast. But yes, I'm drinking it out of a pink cup with a cat icon on it
Thought I saw a cat.
and the language cat puccino.
Uh,
Yeah. I am well today.
yes.
Yes.
Good, good, good. Yeah, I could mention the brand of chocolate, Lucaire. It's very good. Yes, they are. I'm very happy if they'd like to sponsor me and send me free packets of Lucaire every week would be great. Yeah, contact details in the show notes.
Hint, hint.
Yes. All right, so I'm glad we're back together, and I'd like to follow up on what I began in the last episode, which was questioning whether violence works or not. And now I want us to question, like, a bit around what is violence and what isn't. And so I'm going to be quoting from Mickey Cashton, who's an Israeli, emigrated around 40 years ago, I believe, to the United States. She describes herself as a practical visionary, pursuing a world that works for all, based on principles and practices rooted in feminist nonviolence. And she's been really pivotal in my own thinking since I first discovered her by attending one of her, I don't really know what we would call it, like an activist support group in 2019 that she was running for Extinction Rebellion. She was one of their advisors, one of their visionaries, they would call it. And I just really resonated with her approach. And literally, it became like my full-time job to watch recordings and attend her trainings, etc. So she's a practitioner of nonviolent communication, NVC, which is a particular thing. She was a student under Marshall Rosenberg, who founded NVC, but she's developed her own framework based on NVC. And this appears in her organization that she founded or co-founded called Global Nonviolent Liberation. And whilst I don't agree with everything that she puts out, says, and does, the vast majority of it I do, and I really recommend checking her out. And I will put a link to that in the show notes. So, in May 2020, she published an article on Medium called "Is Nonviolent Use of Force an Oxymoron?" And I really love the way that it challenges our thinking around violence. Particularly because she works in the field of nonviolence, and because through my own studying of like Peter Gelderloos and others, um, I have come to believe that the binary between violence and nonviolence is false. And it leads us into places that aren't very productive and actually is counterinsurgent in the sense that it protects the status quo of the state by framing things around violence and nonviolence. So for her to be the one to come out with this "Is nonviolent use of force an oxymoron?" was fantastic because it then touched on the nuance of where I think we need to go. So in this article, she first quotes Marshall Rosenberg, the originator of NBC. She quotes him as saying in a 1995 interview, "The protective use of force is necessary when another person, for whatever reason, is not willing to communicate, and meanwhile, their actions are threatening our needs. So we need to take whatever action can be made to protect against that happening, but we can do that without violence. She says that in that same interview, he also says use force to prevent violence. So, taking that as a starting point, what stands out for me is the phrase use of force and how it's contrasted with the prevention of violence, which implies that it's not violent necessarily, that force doesn't have to be violent. And so, the example I always give when I'm sharing information about this is that a child, a toddler, could be like about to dart into the traffic of a busy road, and you obviously need to stop them from doing that. And you can't say, "Oh, Joey, I'd like to talk to you about what could happen if you run into the road." You don't have time to have a conversation here. You forcibly grab that child, and Joey could be startled and upset by this and cry, and parts of his little body could ache from being grabbed so quickly. Force was used to prevent that child from possibly being hurt or killed in the traffic. So, in this sense, perhaps violence is around like the intention, the way that we are using force. Are we doing it in a violent way or in a non-violent way? So that was how Mickey began the article that she wrote in 2020. And then she goes on to describe a template that she derived based on all of her thinking and collaborative thinking, actually. She doesn't really want to claim it as her own after hearing what Marshall Rosenberg had said in that interview. So she's putting forth a different version, one that she considers to be more operational. And here it is. Use of force is consistent with nonviolence to the extent that we use the least amount of force possible with the most love possible, aiming at recreating conditions for dialogue. That we make the choice using as much non reactive discernment as possible, with as much support for the choice as possible, and while mourning not seeing another way to respond to a situation in which vital needs are at stake, except to use force. So, of course, I'll link to that article in the show notes. So she unpacks each component of this template. And I've read the article a couple of times, and now I just want to take this template freshly, having in mind Gaza. Firstly, the end part of the template says that we're mourning not seeing another way to respond to a situation in which vital needs are at stake. We know that vital needs are at stake in Palestine and Gaza because there's a genocide happening, both from direct use of weapons, physical weapons, as well as through starvation. And so the key here could be what has been tried. And we know that Palestinians all over these years have tried peace talks, have tried nonviolent actions, what we would consider to be standard nonviolent actions. They've also tried things that we would consider to be violent. Now, Israel has upped the kind of force that they're doing. And maybe the Israelis would say that they were responding to a situation in which their vital needs were at stake. Had they tried other ways of responding to the situation before resorting to the use of force? I'm not going to get into all of this because all evidence points to the fact that they did not, and the history of Palestine and Israel points to the involvement of Britain and other state actors. This isn't like a good faith argument that we just want peace, and yet Palestinians, Hamas, whoever, keep fighting us. Like we're like working together collaboratively with Palestinian people. We're not keeping them in an open air prison. We're not controlling them at all. They're not. This is not a good faith argument. We know very well who wins in this kind of genocide. It's arms companies, tech companies. There's very little incentive in their world to look for a peaceful solution from those with the power to make it happen. In fact, Netanyahu is protecting his political power by keeping the genocide going because there can't be any elections. There's just the perverse incentives at play in this horrific genocide are just not hidden at all. So, if we come back to where we are in this moment with this genocide, we can ask, what have activists done? What have Palestinians and sympathetic states done to stop this from happening? What have they been trying to do? And we know people have tried, flotillas and conferences here in Colombia and all of this. Is it working? No, because they're still dying. Is it possible to use force to end the genocide? How would we ensure that the use of force is consistent with nonviolence, which is to say that the force wouldn't just be reactionary, you're killing us, we're just going to kill you? Where would we have the discernment? How would we make sure that decisions were being based on love for the everyday people living in that region? And we would want to gather as much good thinking as possible to decide what to do. So that's my interpretation of what Mickey Cashton says would be a use of force that is consistent with nonviolence in this context. And really, these couple of episodes aren't for us to answer any questions, but to ask questions, to question the status quo around what violence is, what force is, and to be able to think in a more nuanced way and discern the best choices and to be non-reactive as those choices are considered and decisions are taken.
I think this brings to mind a couple of points that I believe I may have raised also during our prior recording about this topic. And toward the end of that prior recording, I must have said something along the lines of pieces of jargon, terminology, are not objective, but instead are socially constructed and therefore subject to social power dynamics, which is to say, definitions are inherently political because of that. And I may have even quoted from the dictionary last time, and that dictionary may have indeed been the first one that comes up on my search engine, Merriam-Webster's online dictionary. And as you were speaking, I brought up the definition of violence through this dictionary again. And I was rather taken aback to see that in some sense, this dictionary, which again is a socially constructed object, has as its primary definition something that actually seems to align, not perfectly, but to a large degree align with what you have just talked about. Violence as a noun, and now I'm quoting, the use of physical force so as to injure, abuse, damage, or destroy. So even in this primary definition, the dictionary appears to distinguish between physical force as violent or physical force as nonviolent. And I found that interesting to grasp in the context of this conversation. Now we can, of course, like I said, dictionaries are socially constructed objects. We can talk about whether the use of physical force so as to injure, abuse, damage, or destroy is the operating definition of the word violence. But I just want to capture for the moment the fact that even in this context, there is an expression that force itself is not inherently violent. Physical force, that is not inherently violent. So I might encourage our listeners to grapple with that a little bit and maybe even explore different dictionaries and how they may define this term to see if those definitions cause some different reflections or feelings or thinking patterns that maybe we haven't grasped or taken the time to think about before. Because in, shall we say, a broad or generic conversation, as someone were to use the word violence in a conversation, I would assume is something around injuring, abusing, damaging, or destroying, to use this dictionary. But if I were to think about the nature of a parent using physical force to take their child away from the street, I'm not sure the word violence would come to mind, even if there is an injury from that. And as you've talked about, there is a certain intention that is embedded in that type of action, that there may be injury that results, but the intention was not to injure. And so I'm sitting with this nuance as well, because I was introduced to a saying many years ago, a saying of the following: your thoughts are none of my business. And that saying is coming back to mind because though we may have an intention, it is difficult for other people, particularly people who don't know us, to know what our intention is unless we express that. And even if we were to express, that is to say, verbally, what our intention is, somebody who doesn't know us may not have any reason to believe that we're telling the truth. And indeed, if we're going to use the genocide in Gaza as an example, we've seen over and over and over again, not the least of which is just this Monday with Israel's, quote, double tap attack on Nasser Hospital. We have seen over and over and over the Israeli government claim that it did not intend to strike certain people. It did not intend to strike journalists or medical workers. That the word used by a member of the Israeli state, I believe, even in a tweet this week, was the word mishap. That is to say, it was an accident, that the second strike, which was caught on live TV, was accidental. And I'm only speaking for myself in this. I will say that I do not believe the words being expressed regarding what Israel's intentions were this week or in prior weeks. And we can talk about other examples, World Central Kitchen in April, for instance, and on and on. So I'd like to explore that with you just a little bit. The notion of intention, and to what degree is somebody's intention relevant, particularly in circumstances where the intention is not vocalized or the vocalized intention is not believed. And I'm not sure I've got really some solid thoughts about that right now, beyond what I've just said. I would be interested to explore and just hear what you have to say, because from what you've shared, I believe that intention, if I were hearing you correctly, is a big part of whether the use of force is violent or nonviolent.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I've run race workshops in the past, and I talk about how uh, when you're saying things to people, it's not so much the intention as the impact. But that's when we're talking about just like microaggressions and, saying things to people. Well, I didn't mean it to be racist. I was just making a compliment, or I was just curious. And so I warn people against like holding on to that wasn't my intention, and looking at the impact. But in the case of violence, um, in the Mickey Cashton template, it's about um, discernment and not doing the discernment as an individual, but doing it with um, people around you. Like you're getting support for making this decision and you are not being reactive. And so I think when it comes to a state, I would want to see, um, I would want to hear their reasoning behind everything and to be able to say why they keep them in an open air prison. Like there's no justification. So they wouldn't actually be able to do this. So they, right there, it becomes like a dead, a dead conversation. Um, I mean, I'd be willing to hear them try to justify it. But I don't think they'd be able to. And so, therefore, we would, um, you know, be at a part. They're not following this template. They're not following the template. But if they suddenly wanted to, it would be, they would need to start dismantling like all the infrastructure and the oppressive structure that they have in place. And then if something happens that they felt like their vital needs were under threat, then that would be like a different conversation, like within that context. Um, so intention can't be analyzed separate from the history, from the infrastructure that they've put into place. Like the kind of logic from which they're operating needs to be questioned. Is the logic that they're using coming from love and coming from a place of discernment? And even their own rhetoric isn't peaceful. Like they'll say things like make a mistake, a mishap, okay, but if you can understand Hebrew, if you are listening to their actual what they're telling people in Israel, it isn't peaceful language. It isn't what we would say, oh, yeah, these people are clearly really don't want to have to use force. It's none of that happening. And again, that's because the real drivers are the power and money around the arms industry and tech. And there's a book called The Palestine Laboratory that shows us the horrific ways that they've experimented on the Palestinian people that's now being rolled out against people in LA and people all across the US and across the world. Facial recognition, all kinds of things that they're pioneering um, in this dystopic world. So, yeah. And then, even if the state agents were saying the right things, we have TikTok videos of soldiers in the IDF, disgusting videos of them not showing any kind of love connected with their use of force. We know that the US culture is sick. I would say the Israeli culture appears that way as well. When you see what the US is doing, like some of the cultural, like the things around guns, and, like we just see that certain things look so embedded within a culture. It's so anti life, anti what it really means to be human, to really care about one another, and to, have this kind of good faith in what we're doing and why we're doing it. And that's really hard for people to be up against. And so I wouldn't say that we go up against it with love, like a naive kind of love. But I think that's another brilliant part about this template is that it's not this kind of turn the other cheek, just take it. You're having genocide, you're being genocided, take it. No, it's what are you going to do? What do we all need to do in the face of people's vital needs not being met at an extreme level? And it could include force.
Yeah, and as I'm leaving our conversation today, and as we promised, or perhaps as we didn't promise answers to our audience today. Sorry for that, audience. Instead, we are offering more things to think about and more complexities, more nuances to think about. And I believe, and certainly a major reason why I enjoy our conversations, Heather, is I believe it is important to practice surfacing and grappling with nuances, surfacing and grappling with complexities in a way, in a space where it's safe to do so, right? Either with ourselves in a safe space or ideally with other people who we care about and who we trust, people who we believe have care and love as intentions, proven by, I would say, proven by their history with us. And I really like how you surfaced history, or I might say perhaps a record of things done and things not done, as a crucial part of providing context for what someone's actual intentions may be, regardless of what they say. And it brings me back to the reflection on force, physical force, and violence from a number of different perspectives. In my recent works, my newsletters and video recordings, I've often made the connection between genocide in Palestine and genocide being at the heart of the founding of the United States of America, just as an example. I myself am descended from colonized peoples on both sides of my family. There's a whole other history there that we don't need to get into today that explains why, or perhaps how, I came to be born and raised in the United States of America. And within that context, this interlinked context of genocide in the so-called Middle East, in the so-called Americas, we can surface this idea of physical force as perhaps even an expression of love. We can talk about, even to be direct about it, we can talk about resistance movements and different types of resistance, some of which do involve physical force. And that's not something we have time to elaborate on today, but instead I might offer a reflection for our listeners about indigenous peoples' resistance, not only in Palestine, but also for our USA listeners, indigenous peoples' resistance here in the Americas as well. And just reflect on whether that type of activity can be an expression of love, can be an expression of care. And interestingly enough, as you talked about turn the other cheek, I was thinking back to how the same book that talks about turning the other cheek also talks about Jesus flipping over the tables of the money changers. So there's not necessarily, in my mind, a contradiction between these two types of behaviors, but to surface and explore these contradictions, it does take time. It does take some personal capacity, and it does take the courage and willingness to at least find a space where we feel safe to surface and explore these nuances, explore these complexities, because the world is complex. It's increasingly complex. And I would just, as we leave our recording today, encourage people to think about where they can go on that journey of embracing those complexities and working through them, with themselves at least, but ideally with other people too.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, and also what it means to resist the genocide in Palestine. You know, what people are calling for, what they're not calling for. Um, and what makes sense in this context. Yeah, it was good to run into you to have our little coffee break.
And you the same.
Yeah, see you next time.
We'll see you next time. I look forward to it.
Bye.
Bye bye. You have been listening to Morning Tinto with Heather Luna and Chris Musay Sequeira. Each time we record, we use the news of the day to be as freshly brewed as possible. So subscribe, follow along, and comment if you can. Let us know what you think, and we will talk to you soon. Bye bye.